Hello and welcome to this week's installment of the Infosec Institute Video Resource Series. This week we are going to be discussing a security awareness topic, and one that's been in the news an awful lot lately, one that you might even be a little tired of at this point, but I want to let you know that there are many new and interesting angles on this topic coming in the weeks and months ahead, and so that's why I invited our very special guest, Susan Morrow, to discuss the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, and especially the first round of implementations and the first intimations of noncompliance and the sort of fallout from that and so forth. So we're going to be talking not just about getting your company GDPR compliant, but also what is actually happening on the ground as regulations begin to take hold and companies begin to be held accountable. So just to start things off, I want to say that Susan Morrow has been working in the security sector for over 20 years. She is currently head of research and development at Avoco Secure and specializes in designing solutions for consumer and citizen identity systems. She has a lot of experience of the good, bad, and ugly of passwords and other types of login credentials, as well as being a fastidious scholar of GDPR regulations. She always tries to put the human being at the center of technology while balancing security, which can sometimes be a challenge. So welcome, Susan Morrow. Thank you for coming back for another talk.
Chris. Yes, talking of challenges.
Yes, absolutely. Lots of interlocking pieces on this particular topic. So let's start today in this discussion with the rudiments. What is GDPR for those just starting to look into this topic? Why are we hearing so much about it, and why is everyone scrambling to adopt it?
Okay, so GDPR, which stands for the General Data Protection Regulation, is an EU directive which is now in law since May the 25th of this year. And it really is a way for the EU to tidy up what was an old directive, the Data Protection Directive that went back to 1995. And it's their way of strengthening privacy, which in turn strengthens some of the data protection that you can apply to data, to make sure that you've got some of that privacy in place, and also to try and make the states across the EU a level playing field. It gets a little bit nuanced as you go through, and we'll talk about that, because there are still a lot of there's a lot of confusion over who exactly it impacts. But in general, you can make a general sweeping statement that if you process the data of someone who is an EU citizen, or that you're processing data within an EU state, a nation state, then the likelihood is that you will have to be GDPR compliant no matter what size you are. Now, right. There are exceptions to the rules, where if you have under 250 employees or you process very small amounts of data, then things like the sort of documentation side of GDPR are relaxed a little. I see. That type of thing. But in general, those rules of looking after EU citizens and so on comes into play. But we can talk about that a little bit more detail later on, because I know there's some questions around how it might impact American citizens, for example.
Right. Now, how did GDPR come into law? This seems like a pretty sweeping law, and the implications of it and so forth. And what were some of the indiscretions it was created to redress?
So in 1995, of course, the internet was, not as well used. It certainly wasn't ubiquitous like it is now. Mm-hmm. I think at the time, there was maybe, I might be wrong with this number, was around about 40,000 websites on the planet.
Yeah, amazing to imagine that.
Yeah, that's right. People shared email addresses. People shared them. They weren't personal. Sure. It was a very different landscape, digital landscape then. Since then, 10 years later, by 2005, things had changed massively. By 2015, they were almost unrecognisable. We have created a mess of data in the world. It's a mess of data. I think that's the plural for data nowadays, a mess.
Yes.
So the GDPR, the EU thought we need to make some changes that reflect a more modern, sort of use model for personal data. People are continuously collecting information about you, whether that's self-registered information, you give it freely to get something back, a service, or they're collecting data in tracking cookies. And we all know about creepy tech. I had to switch Alexa off for this, for example. We all know about creepy tech. The EU wanted to make sure that their older directive was updated to accommodate those changes, and also to have these sort of more kind of less of a mosaic approach to privacy in particular, because privacy, although it's not a new idea, privacy is something that is inherent in us as human beings.
Right.
But digital privacy is actually a fairly new idea, and it's a very complicated and nuanced thing that people everybody has a hard time getting their heads around what privacy is and tweezing it apart from security, because the two are linked, but they're not the same.
Yeah, it seems like up until fairly recently, the notion of digital privacy seemed like something we had willingly given up in exchange for the sort of like the benefits of the internet. Like when you hear people talk, they say like, well, sure, yeah, I mean, well, it's too late now. Like there's no privacy. Like if you're going to use the internet, you got to deal with the fact there's no privacy. But you're saying that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, no, and I'm concerned at the minute of there seems to be a movement towards creating almost like a two-tier internet where people pay for privacy.
Yes.
If you can't pay, tough.
Right.
Tough. And I think that's a very dangerous way to go. It's not an easy nut to crack, privacy, because the genie's out the bag now and putting that back in. But it's not just about us now, it's about our children and our grandchildren. So we need to put these things in place now.
Now, we've been talking about this, and a lot of our viewers and listeners are in America, and they're probably wondering if this is a European system and a European regulation, why so many of the U.S. companies are also scrambling to adopt it. So why is that exactly?
Yeah, there's some interesting aspects to it, and one of the reasons that it becomes so sort of almost unknown territory is because of the often loose wording. I hate to say that because I didn't write it, and I'm sure I couldn't do any better a job, but there's sometimes loose wording around. So it never uses the word citizen, for example. So an EU citizen isn't specifically pointed out in any of the articles within the GDPR. But they do use other terminology, and there's one in particular which I wrote down that I want to mention. It actually states that it says this regulation applies to the processing of personal data of data subjects who are in the union, right? Yeah. Data subjects who are in the union. So this idea of a data subject is basically an individual who the personal data describes. And a data subject, it doesn't actually say a data subject is an EU citizen. It says in the union. Right. Yeah. The EU union.
Yeah.
So
does that mean European
American?
Union?
Does that mean an American in the union who's on holiday? Does it then apply to them? So there's a few little things, and these will come out in the wash.
Okay.
Sure. There'll be test cases where lawyers will use this looseness to take cases to court and test them out. But one of the things that I think is particularly interesting is that, so for a lot of companies to abide by the GDPR, okay, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, if you have people who come to your website and you collect data, which is a type of processing, they collect data, or they pass it over to somewhere else to process it in the EU, for example, or they have an office in the EU, yeah. So anybody who comes to us, they have to be compliant with GDPR. Right. In becoming compliant with GDPR, they have to put certain measures in place. So, for example, I'll give you an example. So they will have to put in place something that specifically, if they're collecting data, that specifically sets out in a granular way and in a very affirmative and sort of plain English manner. We are collecting this data. Are you okay for us to do that? We're going to do this with it. Tick, 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 tick. And you can't opt. There's no soft opt-in. There's no,
Right.
there's no sort of, it has to be. Like, so to do that on a sort of a level where you sort of only show those screens to an EU visitor is going to be a lot more costly in terms of development than to just do a blanket. All right, okay, well, we'll just do everybody that comes to the site.
Yeah.
So what you're seeing is you're seeing a lot of sites who are just doing it blanket, and that's fair enough. Just a blanket coverage, and then we can't worry about it. Everybody's covered. Yeah, we don't need to worry about GDPR. We don't need to worry that we're definitely picking up someone who is in the EU. We're definitely covering all our bases with the EU. We'll just cover everybody.
Yep.
Yeah. So it affects everybody. It affects Americans as well.
So
it's interesting, actually. Sorry, carry on.
No,
I was going to mention. It's interesting because there's a few sites now. A lot of news sites. There's LA Times, I know for sure, and a couple of others like Unroll.me as well, who are basically not supporting EU citizens at all with either the site or their application.
So they're simply just sort of solving the problem by keeping European citizens off of their site. Is that it?
Yeah, that's right. So they won't support. You can't use their site or their application if you are an EU citizen. Right.
Interesting.
So that's the opposite way of what I've been just talking about. Instead of doing a global, we'll just apply GDPR consent, for example, to everybody across the board, because it would cost too much money to, for example, another example would be access to data. It might cost too much money to just give account managers to EU citizens, but not to American citizens, for example.
Right.
So they're doing the opposite thing. They're just like sort of shutting the door on any EU customers. That has a number of, the obvious one is that, well, then they've lost, the great thing about the internet is that you can trade globally. So they've shut off a whole area of the world that they could trade with, first of all. Secondly, it's very difficult to actually enforce those rules because of things like VPNs.
Right.
I use a VPN and I just set it to wherever I want to in the world.
Yeah, sure.
And also, it's actually having a bit of a backlash online as well. And there's a lot of people saying, well, do these companies not care about American privacy then? If you're an American citizen, does your privacy not count?
Right.
So people are getting a bit upset about it, actually. So it's a bit of a backlash.
That's interesting. So with the LA Times and the other sites that are out and out excluding EU citizens, is that just something they're doing temporarily, as far as you know, just until they sort of figure it out, or is this just going to be a blanket policy because? I mean,
possibly it's just a temporary measure.
Yeah.
I mean, with the sort of the news sites, I mean, it may well be that their main customer base is American. But then, if you're an American traveling and you love to read about your hometown,
someone's comment box is going to blow up when that happens. Letter to the editor. So we're far enough into GDPR and the rollout and so forth that have there been any sort of penalties issued yet for noncompliance, and what are the sort of consequences of noncompliance?
So of course the fines are the thing that's made everybody like run around like headless chickens trying to sort it out.
Yeah, they're pretty significant,
because of this sort of. Yeah, so there's two levels. There's a level at 2% or 10 million euros, whichever's the higher. 2% of your global revenue, or 10 million euros, whichever's the higher. And that is for things like if you your controller or processor, they don't comply with the rules of GDPR, so they're out of compliance with that. And then the second level is the higher level, and that's 4% of your global revenue, or 20 million euros. And they're around sort of the breach notification. If you're not using the data subject rights correctly, so you're not using consent correctly, you're not asking for consent correctly, that type of thing, that can get you the really high, because those levels are put in place to show the importance of the data subject being central, and these things like the data subject rights being applied correctly. And interestingly, the biggest headline case brought so far has been Max Schrems, who was behind the original Facebook versus Europe sort of lawsuit back a few years ago now, where he said that Facebook were illegally transferring data outside of Europe and not protecting it. Anyway, he was instrumental. That case was instrumental in the changes to the Privacy Shield.
Right.
So he's taken Google and Facebook, and might be one of, I can't remember now, Google and Facebook, maybe Yahoo, to court over violations of GDPR. He took them to court the day after GDPR was enacted, and he's taken to court on that sort of higher fine level. And his case revolves around consent, and it is this idea of where you offer to take consent, but if the user refuses to give consent, then they don't get the service. So basically, it's kind of a blackmail, using consent as a way of blackmailing users. So he's saying that's not, in the spirit of GDPR. It's out of compliance. So we'll have to watch that one, see where that one goes. No doubt it'll take years and years and years. And it'll be what will be most interesting is how the Facebook and Google's lawyers react. And I'm sure that part of the case, it'll start to draw in some of these tests on some of the more nuanced wording around GDPR. So it'll be a very interesting case to watch.
What do you think some of the what do you think some of the sort of stress points are that their lawyers are going to use to sort of like? Well,
certainly this consent, the gosh, what was it called? Actually, if you wait, I do have that's a coupling prohibition. It's called coupling prohibition. Mm-hmm. That is I think that'll be the main stress point in the case. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but that will be the main stress point in the case. And if Facebook and Google win on that point, then that really does wobble the GDPR. And it's a little bit concerning.
Yeah. Now, so sort of, we know a lot about GDPR mostly by sort of like going through it on a day-to-day basis. All of our, newsletters and stuff are asking us to re-up or, showing us their new terms of service and stuff like that. So as we trudgingly go through our email and click, to accept our 100th terms of service update and reaffirm that we actually want to be on our 50th newsletter, what can you tell our viewers about the real benefits of all this enforced reaffirmation of intent, and what are we actually getting in exchange for this headache?
So the sort of on the good side, it's like I've used it to cull accounts.
Yes.
Because there's been a waterfall of user accounts online. Certainly over the past 5 years, I would say have been the worst. It's been absolutely out of control. Now, whether or not reaffirming has actually ended up in an account removal at the other end of the matter. I'd love to chase it. I'd love to have the time to chase up some of the ones that I've purposefully not reaffirmed.
Yes, I was just going to say I've been getting things from newsletters, 15 years ago, and all you have to do is just sort of whistle and do nothing, and maybe you'll be away from them. Yeah, it's interesting.
I know, it's actually astonishing, isn't it?
It seems like it's a good way to sort of clean out your closet, but also to sort of remind yourself of like how sort of thinly spread you are across the internet.
Yeah, we've all been the internet was designed without an identity layer.
Yeah.
And therein lies the fundamental problem. Everybody has to create their own identities.
Yes.
And therein lies the problem. However, saying that, because this is like a sort of, it's not just about consumers. GDPR isn't just about consumers. It's about employees. It's about consultants, about anybody whose data can be used to personally identify them. But as part of what we must always remember is that technology is just a tool for human beings to interact with each other and use to do jobs. That's all technology is. It's just, it's kind of, because we're like little children with like an exciting toy. We haven't really stopped and sat back and thought, right, okay, this is actually what is behind the technology. And what's behind the technology and what GDPR is really good at is giving us a mechanism to build a relationship with people, with our customer base, for example. And it is really a way to show people that, we're being kind of forced to do this. But if we sit back and think about it, actually, this is a really good thing. Because from a sort of e-commerce perspective, the company can say, right, I've now got a way to go out to this disparate, lost user base and reach out to them and say, you know what, I do respect your privacy, and though I think GDPR is a pain, right? Actually, this is a really good way for me to reach out and say to you, look at what we're doing now, look at these exciting things, and come back to us, and we respect you. So it's a way you can use it as a way to build relationships, and touch the user base again.
Sort of connected to that, how would you, so I think most of us have probably have a friend online or in real life who are, saying, what's going on with all of this? It seems like I keep resubscribing to all my newsletters. I think one of my friends thought it was all a Mark Zuckerberg ploy. Other people think it's just another way of getting, of them ripping you off. So how would you explain GDPR to someone who thinks that, that this is just yet another ploy, I suppose?
Yeah, I know the sort of whole I think privacy's come to the forefront because of negative privacy press, like the Facebook Cambridge Analytica debacle. It is definitely raised the profile, if you like, of what is privacy. So it is a kind of it's a difficult thing to explain to people why it's important. A lot of times people say, well, I've got nothing to hide, so why do I need to be, privacy aware? And there are a number of reasons that you need to be aware of privacy now, because first of all, aside from the sort of increase in cyber attacks and the data breaches, I mean, I think at last count was something like 9.7 billion data records had been breached over the last I think it's since 2013. Gemalto run a breach level index. And they keep tabs on all of this. But anyway, it works out something like 5 million data records a day are being exposed.
Wow.
But as someone who has personally felt, the effects of having my identity.
Hey, Susan, your audio is dropping out a little bit right now.
Hi, can you hear me again?
Oh, now I can hear you. Yeah, your connection kind of got fuzzy for a second there, and the sound dropped. Okay. And
so
anyway, continue. So anyway, you were saying you've gotten your data has been stolen before, and I think a lot of
So I'm aware of it from a personal point of view. I mean, that's privacy is a bit more than just having data stolen, but it's all part and parcel of the same thing. If you can have control over your data, if you can have control over it, and that's really what GDPR is about, giving the control back to the user so they can control who has it and what they do with it. It kind of feeds into the security. It's a sort of almost like a pipeline. It's part of the pipeline privacy, and it feeds back into the security of that data once it's out of your hands. And it adds a little bit of control back into your life, because all of us do feel like our data is out of our control now.
Yes, yeah. That is true. So on a personal level, what are some steps to ensure that you're making the most out of your GDPR changes? So what sort of etiquette things, what can you do with your own browsing history and internet usage to ensure that GDPR is making your experience more free, just as a personal user?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of companies who are taking this very seriously, actually, and they're setting up policies to make sure that things like tracking is within their policy. The tracking cookies are deleted after a certain amount of time. So you can insist on that. I mean, there are provisions in GDPR to allow certain types of companies to use those. So, for example, if they're used for fraud detection, then they can persist them.
Right.
So it's not every company that you would be able to ask for, but the right to be forgotten, data erasure, is a really neat but sometimes tricky data subject right. So, for example, you might have had your genome sequenced by someone like 23andMe. And you can download your raw data from 23andMe, and you can use that in other systems like Prometheus to analyze the genome. So you don't need 23andMe. You stay on there really for the social aspect, so you can share it with family members and stuff like that. But if you feel very uncomfortable about it, like some of us do, you might want to ask 23andMe to download your raw data. So you've got your raw data yourself, and then you can have that removed from a cloud repository.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just about picking and choosing which pieces of data you feel comfortable with, or you might want to, for example, so I don't mind having, given data sometimes for a particular resource access,
yep.
But then I want that data to be removed once I've got the resource. I do not want it to persist. And it's the persistence of the data that I find most difficult. Again, I also augment all of that by using a VPN. And some people might also find privacy-enhanced browsers like DuckDuckGo useful as well. There's a couple of those available. And, it's just little things like that. It's what you as a person feel comfortable with. But now that we've got these data subjects right, like being able to access the data that they've got on you, like being able to check that data is correct, like being able to ask for that data to be transferred somewhere else.
Yes.
Those data subject rights, it's worth everyday consumers knowing about them. It's like, the consumer laws that you have in countries have consumer laws. So if you buy something and then you take it home and you don't like it, or there's something wrong with it, you can take it back and get your money back. GDPR is the same thing, but for data.
Right.
So it's worth understanding it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And that's again, I think that's a really emerging concept within all of this, is that we have more rights on our privacy and with our data than we have been led to believe, and that we've led ourselves to believe. So I think that's actually a very exciting implication. So moving up one step up the ladder to the sort of organizational and enterprise level, what is the best way to find out if your company has made modifications to its data privacy policy? And if they haven't, is this something you as a non-C-suite member of the company can influence?
Well, of course, it extends to employees, GDPR. So all employees within an organisation really should have had, updates to their contracts, and should have been informed. Obviously, if you're a very small company, you can do it in an ad hoc basis. But if it's a big company over 250 employees, and you've got an HR department, the HR department should be on top of this. But from a sort of perspective of, are the people, my customers, are they, being correctly, looked after under GDPR? Or in particular, things like sales people as well, who have to manage customer relationship management databases and so on and so forth. I mean, they would need to be informed themselves, about what the the data subject rights in particular are, what the in terms of what their particular business does, how things like consent would impact their business. Are they taking the right sort of granular levels of consent? Because the GDPR is difficult for even sort of the sort of most privacy and security savvy of us to get our heads around. From a sort of non-technical person, so for example, I'll give you an example. My one of my relatives is in sales, and he has had to try and get on top of GDPR himself and understand GDPR from a sales perspective, and understand some of the nuances like legitimate interest, for example. There's one. Legitimate interest is an interesting one, because that is one that is going to be used in law, I reckon, as a test case. Right. Because it basically says that if you've already taken consent, but you've got a legitimate interest to use that, if you haven't taken consent but you've got a legitimate interest to use people's data, then you can use it. You don't need to reaffirm. Legitimate interest in the GDPR itself, it actually mentions marketing data, what data used for marketing.
Okay.
People in sales and marketing are using legitimate interest as a way to kind of not get around the GDPR, but kind of stop themselves from having such a massive workload to try and get into compliance.
Yeah, it seems like it's sort of a thing where, you're saying I don't have time, like we're in the midst of a transaction and I can't be sitting here and checking for and stuff, which is interesting.
So from an employee's perspective, trying to actually, if you find something wrong and you want a policy change, then show them the money. That's what I say. Tell them what the fines are for non-compliance, and you're doing your company a favour if you're pointing it out. You might not like you for it.
Well, to that end, I mean, I know that it's not always easy if you're sort of lower on the corporate ladder to suggest these sort of things. So if you see that your company's data privacy policy isn't up to code, what can you say or do to convince your C-suite that it needs to be a priority and that they should sort of listen to you?
I think again, show them the fines for being out of compliance.
Yep.
Why if you find some areas that are out of compliance, show them the specific level of the fine that they're likely to incur problem. It should be built in GDPR. Should be built into your security policy, because you have things like a limited time, 72 hours to let your supervisory authority know about a breach, for example. Mm-hmm. So these things should already be baked into the security policy. If they're not, they should be. Also I think there really is a strong case for explaining that it's not just about technology. This is about human beings, and there's a business case for it as much as there is a technology case for it. And again, going back to the business case being that these are your clients, these are your customers, these are your employees. You want to build a relationship with them, and you want to show that it's all about respect and trust.
Excellent. So and you would think that would be enough. So I mean, if you see something, say something, and and certainly the fines are going to be rolling out soon, I would imagine. So going from the other side, the bad side to the good side, how do you think the data landscape is going to change, whether for the better or for the worse, in coming years as a result of these enforced policies? Do you think companies are going to try to exploit loopholes? I mean, we already talked a little bit about that. There's going to be marketing loopholes. There's going to be, and so forth. But sort of jumping forward like 5 years, how do you think this is going to sort of play out in terms of day-to-day privacy and data collection?
Well, I think that is at the same time, there are a lot of things happening in the identity industry that are trying to build a better way to identifying yourself online. Now, it's there's a lot of different industry sectors coming together to do this. So you're finding a lot of things in government, in the financial sector, in e-commerce, and the kind of the planets are aligning, and GDPR it's not a driver for these things. The driver for these things is the ridiculous situation we have with like a plethora of user accounts across the internet. That's the driver for it, and an unsustainable situation. Mm-hmm. But GDPR is feeding it. It's feeding it for sure. And I think what will happen is you'll have new technologies that will be able to take that. The whole idea of user-centric control is not a new idea. It's been floating around. Many years there was a man called Kim Cameron. He's very famous in the identity industry. He's a Microsoft sort of man. He might not have been the person who came up with the idea originally. I don't know, but he certainly he put this idea of the laws of identity into a manifesto, if you like. And one of them was that it was privacy and user-centric identity.
Okay. And
that idea of having control of your data. So identity is just about data. Having control of your data, that is going to be much more achievable because of new types of technologies that are building that as a core of their service. So that's what will change the data landscape. GDPR is feeding that by making it a law that you have to take this into, you have to do it. But the technologies that make that achievable are now coming online. Whereas 10 years ago, it was very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
People are changing as well. People expectations of people.
Okay, how so? Just do you think people are paranoid about it?
The awareness,
yes.
Because of all the cybersecurity threats, because of the privacy issues that are, it wasn't just Facebook, but before that it was Snowden, and the NSA, and because of all these things, it's the planets are aligning. In 5 years' time, it's going to be Hopefully it's going to be very different. Hopefully it's going to be more controllable.
Yes. Yeah. Knock wood. So pulling back more toward the present day as we sort of push our way through peak GDPR fatigue, what are some optimistic signs right now that the regulations are making positive changes in the data security landscape, if any?
I think if you go to pretty much any website at the minute, well, certainly the ones I visit, they are attempting to comply with the law. Some of them are doing it in a very haphazard, sort of hazardous almost way, because I've noticed that some of them are using this, what we were talking about before about one of the requisites of the GDPR is that if people don't give you consent, then you cannot diminish their service in any way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, some services are exempt from that. But if it's something like a news site or something, yeah. But so in particular, the worst offenders for this are tech sites where you go to download a white paper.
Okay.
And if you decide that you don't want them to have your data, they should not be able to diminish your experience. So I've been to a few sites recently, you probably have as well, Chris, where you say, well, I don't consent. And instead of getting the full-blown site, what you get is a sort of, plain text version of it.
Yeah. They put you in a broom closet.
Yeah, very annoying. Very, very, very annoying. But people are doing it, but they are doing it in such a way as to kind of play with it. And I think what will happen is in the next sort of year, a few things will be flushed out, and then I think hopefully people will be embracing it more for what it really is and what it can be. And they'll have the structures in place. Everybody was running around and are frightened, and I've dealt with a few smaller organisations and charities trying to put it in place, and people have had sleepless nights over this.
Sure.
People have genuinely had people who charities who are doing their absolute best,
yep.
To work it, work within the law, they shouldn't be punished. I'll tell you what's interesting. California have just brought in their own privacy law.
Yes.
Yeah. That seems to me to be sort of GDPR 2.0, where they've actually thought through a few things. They've, instead of these massive fines, which will be sort of they'll hit the smaller SME in a much, much bigger way than they'll hit. So Facebook will laugh off 20 million euros.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
But someone who is a small healthcare provider, for example, you could put them under. You could put them under. So the California law, I think, is a little bit of a sort of better implementation of it. I think the GDPR will probably have a few twists and turns in it over the next year or two. And so,
do you think there's going to be sort of a tiered level of sort of fines or punishment based on intent?
It should be, shouldn't it?
Okay.
It should be. Should be. I mean, I know in the UK they're trying to sort of do that a bit more. Make it a little bit more. It's like when you go to court, a magistrate should have the ability to on a per case basis.
Yes.
Rather than having these blanket. But I know why they've done it. I understand why the GDPR have done it, because they wanted to scare the bejesus out of everybody, so they actually did it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fair enough. You have to use a stick sometimes, don't you?
Yeah, apparently.
But hopefully, they won't put any businesses out, or unless the business really does deserve to go under because they really are,
flagrantly disregarding it. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this would be something worth sort of revisiting in the months and years to come. So hopefully we can maybe have you back with more ramifications down the line. But in the meantime, Susan Morrow, thank you very much for your insights today on GDPR. And for all viewers, please check out our YouTube page for a lot more videos on security awareness topics, as well as career track topics, tool demonstrations, tools of the trade lists, and a lot more. And if you'd like to do some reading, we also have a blog, resources.infosecinstitute.com, where you can read articles by Susan and many other people on various security topics, penetration testing, exam labs and various other security topics. So again, have a happy Friday, and thank you for watching, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, Susan.
Thanks. Bye.